Welcome, Internet, to the PixelPlay Podcast, your weekly podcast where three gamers get together to talk everything video games. I am one of your co-hosts, Kaylan, aka Catastrophe, joined as always by my co-host, Adam, CS Radical, and my other co-host, Jin at Jin and Chris. This week, we are going to be talking about preservations and remastering games with the Chrono Cross news that came out. We're going to be talking about whether or not we need a PS5 Pro or an Xbox Series X Pro, whatever they're going to call it. And we're going to be talking about The Last of Us now that it has wrapped up. If you like that and you want to hear more, we have tons of episodes of podcasts where you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, or on Spotify or YouTube if you want to see our lovely faces while we do it. With that being said, gentlemen, how are we doing this week?
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
It's okay. I want to say everything's going fine, but it seems like every time the week goes well, we get just massive snow on another Friday. It seems that's been the trend. So every time I'm like, all right, I've made plans for the weekend, everything's good to go. Bunch of snow.
Yeah, we didn't get that much on the east end here. It was like maybe a couple centimeters at most. I was disappointed to have my snowboard all ready to go.
Oh, the shoveling I have done. My back. My
Nope.
back.
Nope, not a problem here. No, it was like we were all bracing for it. I heard all my friends on the west end were like, "Oh man, like so much snow," and nope, we got like a dusting. I don't even think I had to clean the car. It was like just driving, it all blew off. It was great.
Flowers bloomed on your front lawn. It was crazy.
Exactly.
You know, Chris, I'm just gonna say, you know, that Steam Deck money could have been a snowblower.
We have a snowblower that was given to us by my father-in-law because he broke it. It was his. He broke it. It was new. And we fixed it. He helped us fix it. It was very nice. But we also then rebroke it, and it didn't work for 2 years. We got it working after the snowfall this Monday that just passed. Perfect timing.
Nice.
Thank you, winter. So yeah.
I tried to convince Jen that we should have bought one of those like Elon Musk flamethrowers as a substitute for shoveling the snow. She didn't go for it.
Something.
It's hard.
Laws, you know.
No, not even that. It's just because we don't need it. Because like we live in a townhouse and our parking lot or driveway or whatever is literally the size of our car. So when we back up our car, the driveway's clear. It's kind of ridiculous.
All right, well that might make it easier.
That does.
100%.
That does.
Let's jump into it, guys. Adam, you brought this one to the docket this week. Talking about Chrono Cross being re-released for new systems just to kind of keep it alive. Did you want to kind of run us through, introduce the topic? We can jump into it.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Obviously, like Chris and I will talk endless buckets about how much we love the Chrono series. Chrono Cross over Trigger for me, but I'm also someone who has a memory of a goldfish when I was younger. So now that I've actually finished Trigger and at some point could replay Cross, who knows, maybe it flips over. But Cross is pretty dear to my heart, which really pissed me off when the remastering, the Radical Dreamers edition came out, and it was not great when it launched, which is not what you want to see of one of your favorite games ever when it comes back. But we had a story not too long ago. I'm just pulling up the article here because I have you guys on the screen instead of the article. It came out of Games Radar. I don't know if they were the original publisher of the story, but this is where I saw it. The devs mentioned that they were fearing that the classic game was going to become unplayable because now these days it's still available on like digital stores for a small amount of money on like PlayStation 3, PSP and such, but it's becoming increasingly harder and the steps to do so are becoming older and older because just you're dealing with older servers, older hardware. It's not as easy to do so anymore. So they made the call to I shouldn't say fully remaster it. They didn't exactly do that when they released it, but they'd made the call to get a new port in for newer consoles in order to, I guess, preserve it, really. And based on how it went, it raised the question to me, which is why I brought this up. Should every game, or do even any games, need to have this sort of treatment ever, or should there just be other ways to do it? Because sure, it'd be nice to have games like Chrono Cross get that kind of treatment, assuming they're always done perfectly, which in this case it wasn't. I mean, I'm sure we'd like so many other classic games to get the Final Fantasy VII remake treatment where they are just amazingly well put together, but it doesn't always work that way. I mean, we'll find out I mean, obviously Resident Evil's done really well for themselves. We'll find out even further when the 4 remake comes out. Silent Hill 2, I believe, is the one getting the remake soon, so there's that. Dead Space is obviously worked out. But keep in mind, those games are not nearly as old as, say, a Chrono Cross, which is what makes Final Fantasy VII kind of like the one real notable case of this, because it is around that same era. So,
How
the
dare you,
question
sir?
that I
You forget
pose...
GoldenEye.
Well, GoldenEye didn't... Well, okay, GoldenEye, they tried to remake on the 360 era, and we all know how that went, too. And no one's saying shit because we know exactly what it was. But the question that I honestly pose is, what should we actually do when it comes to older games like this? Do you see a case where companies should be, let's be perfectly honest, wasting budget and time basically preserving games when there are many other effective ways to do it, such as emulation?
I think personally, I think that the emulation route is the better one. Just, I mean, using Chrono Cross and say Legend of Dragoon, that also just was re-released by Sony. Legend of Dragoon, very much more just a PS1 emulator running on the PS5 and PS4. It was a little wonky right at launch, but they fixed it like 4 days later, so it wasn't like Chrono Cross where they finally put out the patch to fix the FPS on it 1 year later, like literally on the anniversary, I think, 1 year later. And the emulation for Legend of Dragoon, it has all these options there. You can have the original image slightly stretched to at least fit, 4:3 on the screen, stretched if you want it to look hideous, in my opinion, and it fills the whole screen, like widescreen, but you're taking a 4:3 image and just really stretching it out. But they've got it where they didn't have to go in and redesign all the textures. It's just because they're polygons and whatnot, the emulators can actually just tweak the textures so they look in a higher resolution and they kind of stand out. It's not perfect. PS1, perfect example of this, all the backgrounds were more like JPEG images, and then the textures of characters would run around on top of it. The textures and the JPEGs didn't kind of look as apart as they do now back then, because it all kind of was CRT televisions and whatnot. But it's still nice that you can, still play the game. It still looks good. And it's just a matter of getting it to run in an emulator, which you can hire any 16-year-old kid who's a fan of PC gaming, and they can probably do this for your company if you're willing to pay them. Where if you take the Chrono Cross remaster, I guess that they called it, similar ideas, the emulation, but obviously they tried to redo some stuff, made it a lot harder and a lot worse. It ran worse on this remaster than on a PS1 at first. Like, just not very easy, not very fluid. If they'd just gone the emulation route, charged $10 or whatever as some sort of PS1 classic, it probably would have been less money, easier, and come out looking, honestly, probably the same. Like, it would have looked like this, but everyone would have been like, oh yeah, but this is just an emulated copy with, the textures rendering up to like 4K and the background's still like a JPEG.
It's a PS1 game. What are you expecting?
It's right? A PS1 game, exactly. Whereas when you put remaster and charge $30-something and blah, 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 and then you're like, oh, it doesn't work that great. Then they start to go with other features like, oh, there's a fast forward feature. It's like emulators have a fast forward feature. That's where you got the idea. Like, just if you go the emulation route, it doesn't just solve one game. It usually will solve like 99% of games that all came out on that same system, right? So, and the technology is mostly there for all these old systems. PC players and fans and everything have been working on this since the 90s or whenever, emulation really started. So, me personally, I think going emulation, charging a reasonable amount and putting it on is better than trying to remaster necessarily all these old games, unless you want to go the full remake like Final Fantasy VII, like Resident Evil, where they're just going to start again and take the story, because obviously there's something to be said for those too. I think both can kind of exist, and Final Fantasy VII shows that, because on the PS4 and 5 you can buy the original FF7 as basically an emulated version, and you can also buy Final Fantasy VII Remake. They're two very different games, and they apply to both people. Like, if you want the retro, you want the new, maybe you want both. So that's me personally where I would go.
Yeah, I think it's a case that it would make more sense that if you're going to put in the money towards it, go all in, go with the big budget stuff like we're seeing with Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII and such. If your idea is just preservation, we need to find ways to emulate this better instead of trying to put like all this manpower in when, like you said, fans do this stuff for, like they do it longer because they take the time because they really care about it. When a lot of companies do these things, they're more doing it as a business practice. A lot of the times they're still trying to make a buck off of it, whereas the fans are doing it because they simply love it. So I think there's a way to balance both, but I think the vast majority of these projects should just be emulated.
100%. 100%.
It raises the question for me of like, what is the purpose of it? Is it so that we can play these games again? Because I wonder how much there is of a demand to play these old games. And if there is, like I've said before, the idea of gaming is that gaming is very iterative, right? What was common, what was accepted, 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, is no longer how we kind of do things. And so old games feel old, and that's the thing. Like if you want to play it, you're gonna play it, and then yeah, you might enjoy it, it might be fun, but like with the exception, a lot of games don't age very well. And that if we do want to preserve this, is it so we can show new players to the hobby, like, hey, this is a classic game, then I think it makes sense to remaster it, right? I think take the quality of life improvements that we've had with inventions and new norms of technology and how we play games and stuff and new gameplay designs and put that in. Like I look at things like Final Fantasy VII, which I haven't played, but I look at things like Dead Space, right? Like Dead Space is really well done, and how it what was an old game and probably very brown and like had its issues. Like it wasn't a perfect game, but a lot of those things were addressed and fixed to make it a better game now for 2023. And so I'm of the mind that if a game is worth preserving, if you're going to go through that, go the full way and do a brand new remaster or remake. Don't just do a half-assed emulation, because I mean, if someone really wants to, like, they can, for the most part, find those games, especially with physical games. But I mean, are we going to, in perpetuity, bring these games with us every generation? Like when we get to the PlayStation 10, are we now going to emulate everything from PS1 to PS10? Like where do we draw the line? So I think if a game warrants that, we want to bring it forward, we want to like reintroduce it to the hobby, then yeah, make a remaster, make a remake. And I prefer remakes. I know I'm using this too interchangeably. Like make a remake of the game, take what we've learned, take the new developments, and make that game in 2020 whatever. That's how I do it. Like from the emulations perspective, like I don't want to play a game that like doesn't translate well in terms of now on an HD TV versus on a CRT TV, or something that had old janky games like game controls. Like we take for granted how standardized it is now to have right trigger being shooting or X being jump or something like that. Like that wasn't a thing all the time. Like each game had its own different controls, and like we take that for granted now. Now, if we're going to do the emulation aspect, like I think the one who did it right is Nintendo, in the sense of like those SNES minis or those NES classics. Like that was the way to do it, because hey, here's a whole collection of that era, and typically it's the best of the best. Sony kind of screwed the pooch on that one a little bit, but yeah, make it where it's like, hey, here's a little consoles, because that gets the nostalgia factor there. Charge $60 for it, and here's a whole bunch of small games, like games of that generation. So it's not just each one individually, but here's a curation of the games that we think were most successful, most interesting, or reflected that generation the most.
Well, I think that's where the frustration comes, because like what Nintendo is doing, they're doing sort of, because I mean, we see with expansion online, like they're doing it a little, like they're doing it sort of, where they throw like 10 games on and then call it a day. And the same goes for PlayStation, where that's what we thought Premium was going to be. We thought it was going to be an emulation station, and then it turned out to be, it's mostly PS3 games, which is not what we thought that meant. There are PS2 and PS1 games, but they're few and far between, and they haven't really added much since the thing came in, to the point that I'm pretty sure that I would love to know, like, as month by month has gone by, just how the numbers have changed from Premium to people just going to Extra, because they went, I mean, I like Extra's library because they do put some stuff in there every month, but like, there's no reason to get Premium, because the one thing, like, and I said it before, it wasn't going to be demos, it's going to be the classic stuff. And right away, we found out real quick that they don't really care much about the classic stuff. You could argue because, well, not that many people play them either. In which case, what was the point of Premium then? Because I don't think demos sell you a whole other platform to be putting on for this thing. So I don't know what else companies can really do if they're not going to put in that level of effort. I think it really just needs to be, if you're not going to preserve it properly, then let the fans just do it and stop putting all these DMCAs in all the time that happen with these emulators and stuff. Because if clearly you don't care until you realize there's, I guess, a couple $1,000 to be made off of it, then it's just being just disingenuous. It's just being greedy as usual. Like, the fans are clearly putting the proper work in. We already have functional Switch emulators, for God's sakes. And whenever somebody's trying to make a classic game, like with the Chrono Cross remaster or the Legend Dragoon, it wasn't necessary because someone's already done it and done it perfectly. So it's literally a moot point. So it's at the point that if the company has cared about it for X amount of time, and it sounds like Square did not care about Chrono Cross until somebody went, shit, all these storefronts that they're on are basically going to be locked away soon. We should probably put this somewhere. That doesn't tell me that it was preservation. That tells me that there's still money to be made. And if you're not even going to put your best foot forward, I don't want you doing it. I would rather people just be in front of it. But we're also asking companies to basically look the other way, which, as we've seen 1,000 times, never happens.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think it's like greed. Like, this is like their license, their property, and it's not to say it's not going to come back. Like, they keep it in their roster.
Yeah, but we're also
like,
talking about DMCAs for free things. Like, not like 99% of these cases are not charging money for them.
No, it's true.
Like, how many times do we see trailers about people doing 4K remasterings? Like, we saw it with Donkey Kong. We saw it with, can't remember which Metroid it was, but somebody was doing it. There was a Mario Kart one recently for 64 that people were getting attention on. Every time these things happen, it gets stopped. And it goes, why? They're not charging anything for it. It's just because you don't want that in the news front, so that when people inevitably pay money for your crappy version of it, that they all go, oh, there's a better version we can use. Instead, they DMCA somebody who is actually putting in the work. You know, there's a guy who is working on Simpsons Hit and Run. I think, Chris, you and I talked about this on Cartridge and Quarters back in the day, and he's not going to release it because he knows it will get DMCA'd. He doesn't want the trouble, but he wants to prove that it can be done. And it shows that if somebody actually puts in the work and gives a shit and, you know, doesn't just cut corners left and right so they can make a quick buck, it's done effectively. And the problem with so many of these companies is that they cut corners left and right so that, sure, they're preserving the game, so to speak, but now the value of it is being lowered because most people, either that played it in the past, they'll just go back and play the old version anyway because it's better, and new players are not actually getting any interest in these games because they're releasing so poorly. As someone who loves Legend Dragoon and Chrono Cross, I can't imagine what it must be like to see a new player go, this game, I don't get what the big fuss is about. It's a buggy piece of shit. And we're all sitting there being like, it wasn't like that before.
Yeah, Legend of Dragoon, use magic, game softlocks. It's like, wait a minute.
Now, if you want to talk about, you know, old NES games, oh, those things are broken. We can't defend that half the time, but, you know, it is what it is at that point.
Yeah, but even with emulation, you have a chance to fix broken code. Because if there is a game that's broken, you can go in and fix something. You don't really have to change the game. It's just like, oh, we're supposed to put a space in this code. We never put the space or an underscore or whatever it is. Like, when they go to re-release it, they could also just do that. Yeah, I think it might be just, it's remasters. It's kind of like remakes. I think we all agree are amazing. They're done well. A lot of love can be put into them, and it's a brand new game, so it's going to feel modern. They're going to give it all that. And then emulation, it's kind of like, here, if you want to play an old game, here's the Nintendo or Super Nintendo classic. You know, Switch Online. I've actually been playing the Switch Online service for the Sega Genesis games, and I also used the Sega Genesis collection on the Switch because I was curious. And the Switch Online's emulation is like leagues better than the Sega Genesis collection. I was actually very surprised how much better one emulation could be over the other. And it showed like it's actually just putting time not necessarily into an individual game, but into the actual like software that'll run all of this and everything. But it kind of makes sense to have those collections of the older games. If you want to play them, here's your collection. Here's your Sega Genesis collection. Here's your 64 collection. Here's your whatever collection, a Final Fantasy collection, you know, whatever it may be. And you can give it to people. They can play it as it is. And like, yeah, if a company is going to give them out in a good package where the software runs okay, and again, it's more about probably the emulator than the actual game itself at that point, then by all means, the companies, like, they can have my money. If there was some, like the Sega Genesis collection on Switch, I bought it because I love so many Sega Genesis games. I'm playing through one right now. But I also love remakes and like brand new interpretations. And it's more just the remasters in the middle that seem to be a little like muddled. It started back on, I mean, for me on PS3, all those like HD remasters that were coming out for all the PS2 games that were just re-releasing on PS3. And it was like, oh, okay, so I can already play the PS2 game on my PS3 because it was backwards compatible, but now I can get one where the resolution has been updated. And it's like, oh, this is a remaster now. And it's like, oh, okay, but what if you just let me play the old one or remade it fully? Like, it's kind of this middle ground where they're still charging a decent amount of money, but it's individual game releases, and it's kind of like, is this the original? Is this a new one? Like, it seems to be kind of that middle ground where it's tough. And I think, like, if that went away, it would be a lot easier because they could just focus on a remake or just focus on making the emulation of the original good. And I mean, you can have one team work on one and one team work on the other, probably more on the remake, I would assume. And everybody would be happy, and there wouldn't be this kind of middle ground where it's like, hey, this remaster sucks. How often do you see that? It's a lot. Usually the remakes, very good scores, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy, Dead Space, all of them, Last of Us even, like really good scores. Emulation for the most part, people are like, hey, it was a $20 package and I got 50 games. I'm not unhappy. It works. And it's always the remasters that have the like, they screwed up this, they couldn't translate this over, blah, 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 blah. And
yeah, it just seems like the more lazy work is being done there.
Yeah, it's like they don't want to just give it as an emulated game because it's not enough money, I guess, or maybe something. I don't know. They don't want to do a package of a few games, and they definitely don't want to do a remake. So they kind of do this half-assed but $40 edition to go out, and you get a Sonic Origins, you'll get Chrono Cross, you'll get all of these where it's like, why? Why are these like this? Why?
Yeah.
It looks like a large part of it is just we'll take this, we'll throw a 40 or a 4K filter over it the computer will just automatically up-res everything, and then we'll call it a game.
Yeah.
I mean, in the end, I think the honest conversation is just that, we want stuff preserved because, I mean, the same way that we still can see films from back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, like, we want to see the same for games, too. I don't want to ever see any game lost to time. The difference is I think if you're going to re-release it on a platform that's current, at least put the work in. I think that's my one request. But then again, we also live in an age where we have new games that don't put the work in to make sure they come out in a decent state either. So I guess it's not really that surprising.
Yeah. Speaking of new generation consoles, there's a rumor that's been going around today that PS5 Pro is already in development, and I think they said it had a release of like 2020, like next year or two. And my question to you guys is twofold. One, or I guess threefold. One, do you think we'll be getting a next half-gen increase like we did with the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One X? Yeah, that sounds right. And do you think we even need one, right? So this is my question. Like, do you think we'll get one? And do you think we'll need one? And is now like the time that we need to start thinking about getting an upgrade on those ones?
I mean, it checks out. I mean, the PS4 was released in November, and about 3 years later, so was the Pro. So we're around that point that, based on November this year, like that would be around the time that we'd see the Pro version of the PS5. So you could make the argument that it probably should already be announced at this point, or at least, it's definitely nearly finished. But if it's like, say, a next year thing, I wouldn't be shocked. It makes sense. I mean, it probably would have been this year had it not been for all the shortages. So they were so busy trying to just get the original console just out to market first before anything else. So I think it's going to be a thing that happens. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have made fun of the design with the current one. I'm sure they're going to make a way to size it down because the thing's a beast. Like, in terms of size, it's one of the biggest consoles we've had in a long time. So I'm sure it's going to be I hope they keep the crazy shape because you know what? I like the fact that it's not just a rectangle anymore. It's the same. Like, I know the Xbox is kind of still a rectangle, but it's not the same level of rectangle.
It's legitimately just a rectangle.
Yeah, it's more just like a really long cube.
That's a rectangle.
It's a weird PC tower. That's what it is. It's a custom PC tower. It looks more like
a post office like letterbox rather than what we got now. At least now you have like a mini fridge now as a console. That's what we get.
I was about to say, guys, it's a mini fridge. Leave it alone.
So like,
Chris, what about you?
In terms of
sorry,
needing
go
it,
ahead.
I think we're definitely due for one, and I think just it's a matter of okay, but what are the improvements? I mean, apart from obviously sizing it down a little bit or maybe changing up the design, so maybe it helps with cooling a little bit more. Like, but what do they buff? Like, are we gonna get a graphic change? Or more games gonna be able to run at 4K 60 frames with high fidelity now, rather than having to have like a performance mode? Like, what does that look like? I think that's really the key thing here too. Is are we going to have 60 frames with the ray tracing at full amount, or are we still having the same, like, you get the ray tracing but it's 30, but if you want the 60 frames as performance? Or do we even get crazier where we get to 120? Like, that's the interesting question too. Do we get even higher frame rates? I doubt that much. I think it's more the 60 frames with the full graphical performance.
Yeah,
Chris?
it's definitely like it, as Adam, you said, it checks out fully. Like that was my first thought, like holy crap, the Xbox One X and the PS4 Pro were about halfway in the cycle, and I guess technically we are. It's just this one feels different, right? Because when the PS4 came out, and I'm assuming I never obviously played Xbox One or anything like that. I assume it's the same. Where they released, I think they maxed out at like 1080p. Like at the time, that was as far as they could go. And even then, it would be like 30 frames per second. So when the Pro came out, it was like, hey, here's the 4K model. Like this can do 4K or 1080p, 60 FPS, or whatever it is that they were promising. It was an upgrade. Where this generation, it feels more like this is already a 60 frames per second, like 1440p, sometimes 4K, depending on the game system. So the Pro feels like not as a big a deal. Like the only way I could equate it in my head is if all of a sudden in the last few years, 8K TVs became a very popular thing. Now everybody's got 8K, and it's like, hey, you still want that 60 frames per second at a higher resolution for your 8K TV? Hey, you're going to need the PS5 Pro, which, I mean, hasn't really happened. Everybody's still 4K 60 FPS, and it's been that way since before the PS5 even came out, like as that was always the goal in general. I do think it's probably going to come. If not, I mean, it would be a PS5 Slim or something. Actually,
That's what I'm wondering. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a Pro. It might just be a Slim.
I
Yeah.
figure it might be both. Like they might actually have like a cheaper PS5 as the PS5 Slim, and now also the PS5 Pro. So hey, don't already have one, buy the Slim, want the Pro, upgrade. I have a feeling that's the way everything's gonna go, because I think, is that what happened with PS4? They had like the Slim, right?
Yeah, I
PS4
think
Slim?
I
they
assume
released
so.
the PS4 Pro and then they came up with the Slim.
Yeah. And then Xbox, same idea. They came out with the Xbox One X and the One S. And they
Yeah.
went like, here is the lower tier one and the higher tier. And if you already want to keep the one you have, now you're in the middle.
That's kind of my
Mhm.
hope, is that what they do is they have a PS5 model that's cheaper. So that way, people can get into the market that have a little less income. But then they also have the beefier version, which you can get if you want to go like super hard on it, which, like we said, could just be 60 frames with full on 4K with ray tracing. Like you usually have to pick 30 frames for.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't
That's a
know.
good
Like,
point.
I'm of the mind, like, I don't think it will actually come to fruition because I feel like the PS4 was in a unique position that it had a longer lifespan than most consoles would. So I think it's one of those situations where we don't necessarily need to have a new iteration of the console because why? Like, when the PS4 Pro came out, like, the console generation stayed longer than it needed to, but there was also changes in televisions and displays, right? Like 4K became more popular, HDR became a thing. Like, is there really any technology that's occurred that justifies that? Like, I don't think there has been. Like, 8K is not. I don't think it's even close to becoming mainstream yet. Like, we
No.
don't see content for it really.
Oh, God.
So, from a displays perspective, what's the need? From a 4K ray tracing, performance, fidelity, all that. Sure, I guess, but like, I mean, my TV doesn't have like the peak frame rates. Like, it's pretty much peaked at that performance. And like, do I want to drop another 5, 6, $700? Because remember, the PS4 Pro was more expensive. Are you going to pay that much more on a console that's already pretty expensive to just get fidelity and 4K ray tracing? Like, we haven't even gotten to the point where there hasn't been a PlayStation 5 exclusive yet. Like, everything is still being held back by the PS4 because the delays of getting that system out. So like, I don't see why there's a need. I see this being like a shorter console cycle, and maybe in 4 years we'll get into PS6. Like, I don't think it'll stick around as long as the PS4 did, because like, people are just starting to get their hands on it. If they said, "Hey, we got the PS5 Pro," I think a lot of people would get pissed that they just bought the console and are being told there's already a new iteration of it. So
Yeah,
I can see it slim, but I don't see like an improved, beefier system.
I think the general argument from a business side is, I mean, how many people buy iPhones every single time a new one comes out? Do you really need the upgrades with the iPhones? I'm sure there's a lot of them thinking like, okay, well, we're already planning on building a new model anyway. Why don't we try something with the PS4 Pro models, and that prepares us for PS6? And we'll throw it out there, charge a few more couple bucks. There's going to be a bunch of suckers out there that are going to spend the extra money on it because they always do. So I think from a business side, they're always going to make that thing. I think that we might be at a point now that the Pro just becomes a normal thing with most of these consoles, just because they've seen what mobile devices do and how easy it is for people to just suddenly drop another $1,000 on something that they don't actually need. But because it's the newest and greatest tech, they're going to do it. And I think also, if they end up getting really clever with it, you can find a way to bundle that along with PSVR 2 to really increase some sales with that as well. So there's some finagling you could do to try to push into other things as well. I'm not sure how. I'm not a business professional, so that's not my freaking job. But I'm sure that, you know, the thought is coming across that they need to push those more as well. Now that those are coming out, I don't have no idea how the sales have been so far. So I'm sure there's a lot of ideas they're going to be coming up with to try to make some more cash flow coming in, whether it's selling more console. Like, because again, the people that bought PS5 day one, do you think they're not going to be wanting to buy a PS5 Pro day one if they can? They always do. So I think it's not a matter of do they need to, it's a matter of do they want to. And I think the answer from a business side is always going to be yes. Do we need a PS5 Pro? I could say probably not right now, because we haven't seen a game that's been pushing the console so hard that 60 frames isn't really doable. That Digital Foundry video of, oh, this Sony first-party exclusive is not able to hold 60 frames anymore at, you know, X settings, it's not happened yet. So it doesn't seem like the hardware is being pushed enough that it's necessary. Now, if they throw a game out there that proves that it does, okay, well then you got something there, but I don't see what that is right now, so I don't think we have to think about that currently. I think I agree with what all of you said, where we're at a point that this console's kind of doing what it's supposed to do and is doing it just fine and doesn't need any help. So, I mean, if there's a slim version, I think that's a different case. If it's a cheaper, more effective version, and also one that, you know, actually fits in most people's TV stands, I think that would be one that, you know, is a fair trade-off. I don't know if a Pro is necessarily needed, though. Will they still probably make one? Yeah, but I don't think any of us here are going to be sitting there clamoring to get one.
I might. I'm a sucker like that.
Oh, 100%. I've already pre-ordered. It doesn't exist yet, but
in the same vein that I'm sure somebody finally got a hold of a 3090 for their PC after spending like $4,000 on online auctions, and then the newest ones just got announced. They're like, well, there's another 10 grand I've got to friggin' find room for.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see. I still think it, like, the rumors that like the lead was kind of very skeptical in terms of like how accurate it is, but I thought it was just an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think it just seems like a safer bet just based on the time frame that we're sitting in now. That it's been almost 3 full years now. And, you know, we'll definitely have an idea of it if Sony ever decides to say, hey, we're doing a big showcase, which, you know, a certain other company has at least announced a date for. So who knows? Maybe it's something that we will find out about this year, and maybe we won't.
Yeah.
I think that if it does get announced, I'm trying to think like what's the technology they'll push. Like, this is the reason you
maybe
need
a bigger
it.
SSD.
The only thing I can think of is ray tracing, because as you guys have been saying, like you've been throwing it out there a lot, that's like the 4K or HDR or whatever that's become more popular recently. But I think that a lot less people care about ray tracing than like 4K when people cared about that, or even HDR, right? Like, I think that it's screen stuff like that, like resolutions, people care a lot, but it's like, no, but like, look at the reflections of light. Some people are like, no, I don't need I'm not going to spend $700 for that though. I don't see it.
Yeah. Even like HDR I find is so hard because like consoles are so different and like TVs are so different that you always get that screen of like, hey, adjust your HDR, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I'm like, I don't know, like,
it's like I thought I hit auto and so you did that for me.
Configure it.
Yeah, what happened? Yeah.
So, I don't know. Sticking with Sony, just if you guys miss it, The Last of Us wrapped up this week. Adam, I know you have no taste, so you're not watching it, but Chris, have you finished the series? I thought we could maybe talk about it a little bit, what we liked, what we didn't like, and just Adam, to include you in the conversation. Like, is this the best? And you can't answer this, but like, can video games be translated into TV or film? Like, did this prove that the concept works, or games not just good, or games not conducive of becoming TV and video games? So
I think The Last of Us and The Witcher have proven that answer is an emphatic yes.
I can have I think that's an interesting conversation because I have bones to pick with it. As much as I love The Last of Us, there are some issues with it. So I thought we could do a quick review of Last of Us. Was this successful? Did we like it? What didn't we like? Things of that nature, and then get into a larger conversation of, does this prove that the concept works? So, Chris, what did you think overall? We'll go full spoilers. You can kind of talk about whatever you want. There's no structure to this. What did you think of The Last of Us?
I think I obviously still loved it. Like, it's still my favorite video game adaptation of anything ever. The only thing that kind of comes close, and this is purely biased, is the original Mortal Kombat movie. Like, that obviously is still very much the game brought to life. But this, like, I still did really, really love it. There are parts, obviously, that they changed throughout the story. Ways they presented stuff, like even just the way it ended, with the hospital scene in the show, where I felt in the game it was more intense because like, obviously you're doing it. I felt it was like the middle of the night and it was dark, and it was like, you know, it felt more like anxious, like you have to get to Ellie before this happens, whether you agree with what you're doing or not. Like, as the player with Joel, it's still like a very intense moment, where here it wasn't intense at all, in the sense of like, oh, Joel's got to get there in time. It was more like an emotional approach that they took with it, like nice Last of Us music playing over while Joel murders people. And it was more just like showing like he's made a decision. You pretty much know how it's going to wrap up, but like it's going to be more of an emotional way to showcase it versus an intense kind of like I don't want to say scary, but like an intense tense. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Where tense moment. So there was different ways they presented stuff, obviously, and some stuff I liked. Some of it I preferred the way the game presented it. You know, there's some stuff I like actually both. The third episode with Bill and stuff, I came to really appreciate that episode in what like it was on television, but then I take a moment and I think about what I lost from the game and I get really upset. But then I play it out only as the game, and then I think of the episode on TV that I lost, and then I get upset I'd lose that. So it's kind of like there was moments like that. So overall, I think it was really well done. Still probably the best video game adaptation ever. I'm glad HBO handled it, because I think that if this was on Netflix or something, no way would have it turned out like this. It would have been awful.
Would have been Cowboy Bebop.
Yeah, and oh my god. And I think that even then, it's not like it couldn't have like they could have taken the game, left it exactly as is, changed nothing, put it on screen, and for the most part, it would have come out very much the same. I think it was more that they wanted to take a little bit of artistic difference, like, oh, that won't translate to TV well, let's change this a bit. And then in the end, it's kind of like, no, you could have left it the same. That would have been great on TV. People would have loved it. You just don't want to just copy paste. You want to change it a bit because you have a chance. Yeah. So I think it's more like the writing, and I think that that's up to the writers wanting to do that versus like it couldn't have been translated to TV.
Yeah. So. I agree for the most part. Like, I really like the show. I think this is the best adaptation we've had of a video game, and I think like it's good. It's great. Like, I enjoy it. I like it. I think though there was problems with this as well. Like, I think people have kind of talked about like there's a lack of infected and lack of clickers, and I think that kind of leads to the credence as well, in the sense of the impact doesn't feel as big because the clickers don't really seem like that big of a threat. That like, okay, just avoid the populated areas and like you'll be fine. Like, it's either there's people or there's not. Like, either there's people or there's clickers. They're not a threat in and of itself. Like, I feel like that kind of minimized the threat. And I think there was an issue with pacing in this show. I think like it was good because like they hit all the major beats and stuff, but I think one thing that was lost is that you play The Last of Us for 12 hours. Like, you get to see that relationship blossom between Joel and Ellie. But in the show, it doesn't come across because we are moving so quickly through all these scenes that it's like, and Jen kind of made this analogy, it's a Scooby-Doo episode where every week it's, hey, we meet a new person, they die, and we just keep on going. Like, there's no sort of breath in between. There's no sort of like moments of just Joel and Ellie, and like you get those moments where Joel's telling Ellie about the world and she's learning, and like they're developing that relationship. Like, you get very little time where it's just the two of them interacting together, and going, like, I feel like they kind of wasted some time in that show. Like, they didn't have a lot and they wasted it. And for example, this is going to get a lot of hate because I know a lot of people really like it, but I felt like episode 3 was a bit of a letdown. Don't get me wrong, from a television perspective, it's a great story. Like, you know, people finding love in an apocalypse, great, fantastic. But it didn't contribute to the story at all. Like, for a show that was moving so quickly, it literally was like, hey, let's talk about this little side story. That's even a side story because Frank doesn't show up. He's literally just he's there for a couple minutes. And like, you lose the infected, you lose like seeing Bill as like a curmudgeon, which isn't huge, but like, you don't get that interaction of Joel and Ellie and how they're interacting with Bill, right? And so, is it a great piece of television? Absolutely. Fantastic episode, but I don't think it contributes anything to The Last of Us other than some general setting. But like, I feel like that time could have been spent them building bonds and connections and giving more time for their relationship to breathe, in the sense of like, I think of when they're at like the record store and Ellie's like, whoa, like, it's sad that all this music isn't here. And Joel's talking about like him playing guitar, or when they're in the coffee shop and Joel's like, hey, like, we used to come here for dates and stuff. Like, you get those moments where they're just kind of being heartfelt with each other. And I think that would have made the impact of the final moments more meaningful. But right now, like, it doesn't, I mean, it's not like they didn't have a relationship, but it wasn't as impactful. And I feel like that's because they rushed and we're getting too much to point A to point B to point C, and spending time with those characters. Like, even the raiders or the slavers in Pittsburgh, like, you spent too much time fleshing them out for no purpose. Like, it didn't matter in the end. So, yeah, I think overall, like, it's really well done. It's really good, but I feel like it was rushed, and I don't know. I think they could have done some things differently, but I still highly recommend the show. Like, if you are a fan of the game, you'll like the show. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think a big part of it would have been fixed if it wasn't 9 episodes. Like, because I think that it's all that travel in between cutscenes that you spend with Joel and Ellie when you're playing the game. You're spending like 2 hours getting from one city or whatever to the next. You're going through, you're searching, there's clickers, you have to go into a dark building, make your way through it, come out the other end, you're outside, there's a sigh of relief in the game, there's some back and forth with Joel and Ellie, you go into another building, continue. Like, there's a lot of character building in that time, and you actually, as a viewer, get to actually like grow with them or kind of get to know them and everything like that. And they kind of were, obviously this felt very rushed because it was like one major cutscene to the next, and each major story cutscene was an episode, but it was taking out all that stuff in the middle. And yeah, I think that would have made a huge difference if there was more episodes in between of just like them having to go into a building, like from the game, where you're going through a sewer, you're going underneath whatever, you're going through a dark building, it's the middle of the night, and there's clickers, and they just did some of that scary but travel together like world building and character development. Because that for me was definitely lacking. Like, it felt rushed. That one episode where they went to the university and to the dam, with Tommy.
Yeah.
Like, that shouldn't have been one episode. That was just like, hey, we found my brother. All right, just kidding. Let's go to this university. Oh my God, we're here. Okay, time to leave because I've been stabbed. Let's go. And it's like, what just happened? Like, how did we get through 5 hours of gameplay in like 45 minutes of show? Like, why wasn't this split? Even if the dam part was fine keeping it a little shorter, then why wasn't the university a full episode still on itself? Like,
yeah, like, hey, we're here. Nobody's here. Like, this was the whole purpose. Your X marks the spot was that university, and nobody's there. Like, there could have been a whole episode of like trying to piece together what happens, right? And like, they could have done something like that, and then you have more infected, right? Where it's like, it's not has to be the whole episode, but like, if they're like, hey, what happened? And then you can have infected there, and you're like, oh wait, shit, are those the fireflies? Well, where do we go now? And like, have it almost be sort of like a mystery in terms of like trying to piece out what happened here, you can even do flashbacks, right? Like do flashbacks of them like working and like doing experiments on the monkeys, and then the monkeys bite, and like because at this point they're like, hey, there's monkeys here, but they never talk about the fact that the monkeys were the ones that gave like that bit the fireflies and gave them the cordyceps virus.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and in the game, I'm pretty sure when you're into the university, like Joel
he
falls
goes in a
down
dorm.
into the dorms, and the dorms are like obviously in a very bad way. It's like what are they called, like the hive or the nest or whatever, wherever
Yeah.
the cordyceps are all over the wall and stuff. And I
Mhm.
remember in the game, I was like, oh crap, this sucks. This is horrifying. And there was collectibles and stuff there where it actually told the story of the students that were there when the outbreak first happened.
Yeah, waiting
And
for
they
like
were
rescue, and
yeah,
it's not
they were
coming.
just abandoned. And it's like they could have played into that a bit where
Do
like
cutscenes like as he's going through and he's finding stuff, like you could have a little side story going on, like as he's finding like Becky's notebook. You could have a scene of Becky like figuring out that nobody's coming and like how they do that. Like
yeah,
there's just so
they-
many ways, and there's stuff they did too that just didn't make sense. Like they had the whole aspect of like the fungus and like spreading out, and if it like squeezes like a little bit, it triggers all of them. Nothing was ever done with that. Like they're
Yeah.
just like, yeah, they have a net like a whole network. Okay, cool. Apparently we don't see them though, so like it's fine.
yeah, this network was like touched upon and it was terrifying because that was a new addition.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you shoot one clicker, like they may all now know where you are,
Mm-hmm.
like in the area, and you're screwed because of this like hive network. And then it just never came up again, and they're killing clickers and all this other stuff, and it's kind of like, oh, and like just nothing about the hive. Like there's no network anymore. That was just one episode. Like I don't know. Yeah, the pacing I think for me was the major issue. I would have liked that they spread it out more. Didn't make it 9 episodes, make it like 12.
I think
Add
12 would
more
be the sweet
stuff.
spot.
Yeah, like just add some stuff in between, flush it out. Really make us grow with these characters so that by the time we hit the final episode, we like feel what the fuck Joel is feeling. Because I think that even that a consensus I got online is there was some people that were like, by the time we got to episode 9, it was rushed, and I didn't feel the impact of Joel going after Ellie like I did in the game, because it was just all of a sudden 2 episodes before the end, Joel started to get along with Ellie again, or in general, where in the game it was a much slower burn where it like finally he started to really care, whereas here was like I don't care. Final 2 episodes like, oh, I care now. And the last episode he's just super.
But also like, sorry, go ahead, Adam.
I was just gonna say, so it confirms in, because I obviously didn't watch. So the last couple episodes, like the game or the series does end towards when the game ends, right?
It's exactly beat.
So
for
it's
beat,
basically start to finish. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems, Chris, is that at the beginning too, he doesn't have that dismissive attitude towards Ellie. Like, I think like the first episode, he has a moment where like the guard's pointing a gun at Ellie, and he has a flashback to Sarah, and that just doesn't kind of work because, like, so already you're kind of hinting that he's gonna have feelings for Ellie, right? Which shouldn't have been the case. It should have been like, not to say like Ellie gets shot, because obviously she can't, but I felt like they went too quickly in showing that he cares about Ellie, and it should have been a lot colder and a lot more annoyed about this girl coming along with him.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, because in the game he was more disconnected. His daughter died. He is fully disconnected, and she's a job. Where in this one it was like he sees her, she's threatened, and it's like immediate daughter PTSD. Like he immediately has it, and it's like, it's it should be the more disconnected. And maybe this plays out because they were rushing it, and they had to go from nothing to fully wanting to protect her in 9 episodes versus over a period of 15 hours of gameplay, right? Where you can have that slow burn through comments while you're just walking through a building and Ellie's trying to do a pun or something, and it's just he's like, I don't care, you're a job.
Yeah, like shut up, Ellie.
Yeah, and then it slowly comes up, where here it's like episode to episode, it's like, all right, episode 1, we're gonna have him have some PTSD. By episode 3 he's going to be here, 7 he's here, and then 9 he's fully in. And I think it's a pacing issue on that too, or maybe just a writing issue. I don't know. It could go either way, really.
I mean, it gives me the sense that we've had these conversations before with other properties, and this clearly seems to be one of the best examples of taking a video game and applying it into a television standard. It just seems to prove our point, though, that just games are not that easy to do in this format. It almost seems like it's just so much better off if you're going to use a video game property to just go original. Because even when you're going, because it sounds like they went pretty much point for a lot of stuff in this, and they still didn't have enough time, and they still missed a bunch.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like a budget issue, if it's just
with HBO.
Yeah, HBO, like they're like, listen, yeah, we're gonna do this. It'll be kind of expensive. You know, we'll do 9 episodes a season. Can you get the whole game in 9 episodes? And they were probably just excited, like, yeah, we can totally do it.
Yeah, it seems like
And
if it's
really,
a budget concern, like at the end of the day, it just seems like, again, as we've said so many times, Hollywood doesn't give a shit enough about games that they're going to give it that kind of
No.
budget. So whenever we hear things about like, oh, they might be making a Mass Effect movie, oh, they might be doing a Splinter Cell thing, and we're all like, great, they're going to ruin that too.
yeah,
Because they never give it the time of day. It's just they see the money that's been printed elsewhere and go, yeah, we can get a cut of that. And it seems like, at least with The Last of Us, like the sense that we all got, and even myself who doesn't really care much for the game, I still watched the trailer and went, no, it looks like they've given some care to it. It looks like they actually are trying to make something with this. And even then, like you guys have said, there's still a lot of holes. There's still a lot of things to poke in it. And it just seems like it's, you know, the best case scenario is kind of this, where it's going to be pretty close, but it's still not going to feel right. And it just seems like an inevitability with the limitations of what film can do, because game experience, when it comes to telling a story, is so much different than telling it through film. It just isn't the same.
Agreed. Yeah. I think for me, like, it's one of those situations, like, it's the same as like books. Like, books get adapted into movies and TV all the time, and anyone who's ever read the book has always said, like, the book does it better, and it's because it does something that TV and like movies can't do, and that you get inner monologue, you get inner emotions, and like you get to like you get a sense of agency, not in the agency that you can control, but like you're making the visuals, you're like creating the settings in your head, right? And the same thing is with a video game, in that you have agency, in that you're not watching someone do something, and I mean you are, but like you have agency in the fact that you're doing those things. So if you look at something like Spec Off the Line, you're the one that's committing those atrocities. If you're playing Last of Us, you're the one who's Joel. Like, there's a sense of like projection onto that a little bit, and I think that's something that a TV show and a movie can't capture. So I think it's like it's never going to be a situation where a show or a movie will ever be as good as a video game, because I don't think they can. It's the same idea with books. Like, they're a separate medium. They have their own strengths. So,
well, and the biggest reality too is you cannot show the player failing in a television show. You cannot show the struggle of learning a mechanic or learning a part or learning how to get past a boss fight. Can you imagine if they tried to do a movie based on a Soulsborne game? Like, what's that movie? The guy dying 200 times? Like, it doesn't translate to film. It's impossible. You know, even in a game like The Last of Us, how many times do you die in that game on average? I'm sure it wasn't once or twice. And you can't have Joel die in this TV series, because he doesn't. So all of the fail states can't be included. All the times that you, like, if you're playing any sort of game like a Call of Duty game or first-person shooter game where you accidentally shoot a civilian and you have to restart the mission, you can't do that in a television show. I mean, I'm sure at some point somebody might try to do it and it'll be like tongue-in-cheek, like a Deadpool fourth wall breaking level show. But like, we kind of got that. It's called High on Life with that Justin Roiland before, you know, obviously the controversy made, where it literally makes fun of all the things you normally can't do in games. So I'm sure if they did something like that, they could. But like, most of these television shows that are actually going to put any sort of budget to them, they're going to be taking them seriously. And unfortunately, when you can't showcase the main part of a video game, which is the struggle and the hardship and the failure, you can't do that in a television show, because you have to put that time to something else. You can't have like half of an episode being, you know, the person trying to get through a gunfight and failing, because then people lose interest if they're not on the outside. And even if you're a big fan, I'm sure watching that on screen isn't going to be the same either, because it's not you playing it, it's you watching it. In the same way that I can't watch most people playing a game on Twitch, I can't imagine it being any different if you're watching fail states in a television show. Eventually be like, okay, this is stupid. He keeps screwing up. Like, what's the fun in this for me? Like, there's no story here anymore. So I just don't think it translates the same way.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a translation issue. Kind of like Kaylan, you mentioned with books. Like, there's just going from one medium to the other will never be perfect. But I will give The Last of Us the credit it deserves, in the sense that they cared about this a lot. Like, this is not the Dead or Alive movie where it was just they're cashing in.
No, and
this
they
is
also
not
had
the
the best chance too because it's such a story-driven game.
Yes.
Whereas
yes.
Dead or Alive is about big titty women punching each other. So like, there really wasn't much there.
Well, they didn't give it to HBO, Adam. That was the problem with the Dead or Alive.
I think it's a thing of just things are going to get lost in translation. It's going to get lost in adaptation. And for me, I don't think it's one of those things. Like, I think Last of Us proves, both in a good or bad way, that like, one, you're never going to adapt a video game 100%. Like, it's never going to be as good as the game. At the same time, though, it's a proof of concept that you can take video games and make successful shows out of them.
Yeah, you know where the actual bar is now.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think like there's the idea of like The Last of Us, I don't see it being something that's made for me, right? Like, I've played the game, I know the story. Like, if I want to indulge in The Last of Us, I'll go play the video game. It's about the same length anyways. But who this is for my dad, right? Like, my dad doesn't play video games, right? He has no idea about The Last of Us, and I'm not going to be able to convince him to say, hey, want to watch me play The Last of Us for 12 hours while I finish this campaign? He's not going to do it. But now that there's The Last of Us HBO, I can say, hey, Dad, check out this show. And now he knows more or less like what the story is, right? So he knows that The Last of Us is a huge game for me. It's my favorite game of all time. Hell, he bought me the PS5 version for Christmas. He now knows about the story. We can now talk about that show. We can talk about that story. He doesn't know the changes. He doesn't know the differences. And so I think like these adaptations are great for people who maybe are missing great stories, but don't have the skill or the interest in playing a video game.
I think the one caveat at this point is that you got to pick the right properties to do it, because you know, there are just some that just aren't going to translate. Like, if it's something that's very game intensive, you can't just, you know, throw a game in there and suddenly expect it to work. You know, like I said, I keep going back to it because every time I hear the Mass Effect movie being a thing, I go, no, don't. There's too much. The game is like 40 plus hours, and so much of it is cutscenes. You're not going to fill it all in. You're going to miss out. Like, let's say it gives you, like, how much was each episode for Last of Us?
I'd say it averages at an hour.
Okay,
yeah.
So let's
somewhere
even
like
argue that they
minutes,
give it the full 12
minutes.
episodes if they gave Mass Effect. That's still 12 hours. And that's probably barely covering all the cutscenes, but you still have to cover combat. You still have to cover, like, all of the walking around and exploring new places. You can't do that. I think you really have to decide, if you're going to use a license, can you make the canon story work in the amount of time that you have, in the budget that you have? And if not, is it not smarter to take either a side story or completely an original concept and go with that and just keep it in the universe, so that, you know, in the way that like The Mandalorian's done really well for itself, because it's sort of in the same universe, but it's enough outside that it has its own story to tell and it's not trampling over anything. So I think there are a lot of games where you could make that work by putting something in the vicinity of it, but not directly the same thing, because at the very least then you can write something different and people aren't going to be sitting there poking holes left and right. Well, they missed this, or, well, that wasn't like this and this thing. So that way you can't elicit that reaction, because even in a show that seems to be done this well with The Last of Us, there still is that much room for people to go, but they didn't do this.
Well, that's like, I think one of the shows that's going to do really well, knock on wood. I mean, there's tons of hurdles that they have to overcome, but one of the shows that has potential that's been greenlit and is being worked on is Fallout. Like, I think Fallout is going to be a great show, because there are so many. It's really what you're using is the world, right? You're using Vault Tech, you're using the Brotherhood of Steel, you're using, you know, the Enclave and all that. Like, you don't have to take a video game and make a video game story into a show. You could literally make your own Fallout story and still have all
just
those.
Make up a new vault.
Exactly, right? Like, you can make a new location, make a new vault, and tell your own story. And they did that at one point. Like, there was a YouTube group that was making like a fan fiction Fallout game or a Fallout show, and it was great. And it had nothing to do with any particular game. It was just, we've taken the Fallout universe and we're now telling a story in the Fallout universe. And if I was the showrunners, that's what I'd do. If you're a fan, you play the games.
Concepts that work so easily, they seamlessly transition. Fallout's a great one.
Yeah. How much would you both love if HBO got the rights to Uncharted and grabbed Nathan Fillion and did some like side Uncharted story?
Honestly, now I'm not sure how I'd feel about it, just because of how long it's been. Like, it feels like that part's gone now.
We have an Uncharted movie. It's called Indiana Jones.
But
we also have an Uncharted movie. We just don't talk about it.
I mean, to be honest, Uncharted is just a ripoff of Tomb Raider, which was just a ripoff of Indiana Jones. Like, really, we've come full circle.
I do think you could make an effective Uncharted TV series, though, if you wanted to make a completely original idea of Nathan Drake on another journey. I think you could do it. But it's just a matter of, would it be done effectively, and would it be done with enough care that it would actually feel good, or would it just be another show that's on another streaming service? Like, that's the other thing too, is, you know, these things are still so few and far between that there's not really a middle ground, because there isn't enough of them for there to be a middle ground. It's either going to be one of the best or one of the worst, because there isn't really enough to have like, oh, these are the 5s, 6s, and 7s. Like, there's basically just, here's the 9s and 10s, and then here's everything else. So
I think when you're filtering out which games to take into TV shows, you have to ask yourself, is the story compelling without the combat or without the gameplay? And I think Last of Us is, right? If you watch the Last of Us cutscenes, they're entertaining. Another one that kind of jumps to mind is like something like Heavy Rain, right? Like Heavy Rain, you could make into a show pretty well, because
the Telltale Walking Dead games would be great. Like if
they did make a lot.
wanted to do a spin, basically use one of those stories as another spin-off for Walking Dead, they could do that.
Yeah,
it'd be better than the last 7 seasons of Walking Dead.
Yeah. So I think you have to find a game where, like, if you extract the gameplay, it's still interesting, right? Like, or it's still like, because you can't do something like, I mean, someone would argue you could do Elden Ring, but like, it's not about that. It's about the gameplay is as integral to the entertainment as the story.
And also, like, Hollywood, because they feel like they have to live action everything, there's just some things that don't work. I mean, look, Cyberpunk Edge Runners won Crunchyroll's Anime of the Year this year. So, like, there are ways around it. Castlevania did really well on Netflix with the animated series. So, like, it's also showing, too, that not everything needs to go the Hollywood route. You can find a good animated studio and put it together a much better product, because it can be more true to form, because animation doesn't have the limitations of what stunts can do, because it doesn't nearly have to worry as much about, you know, the crazy budgets that are required for that level stuff.
I mean, we'll see, because I mean, like, Mario movie, the animated movie, is coming out in April, and we already have a live action, so we're gonna have to kind of weigh them and see which one like works out better.
Well, I feel like that might be not a great example, but you know, we'll go with that.
Okay, fine. I'm back on my Nathan Fillion idea. He's going to be taken by HBO. It's unrelated to Uncharted. It's going to be a show called Charted. He goes to an island he's already been to before. Okay?
It's called Not Charted.
Not Charted. Him and his friend Solly will. Actually, Adam, you had a really good point about the animation.
It's just literally them at a bar the entire time, being like, "I'm not going there.
I'm not going there. I'm not going there. I'm staying here." The animation point, just one thing I want to say about that is that's actually a really good point, because if you take a show that's not based on a game, well, I mean it is, but it's a tabletop game, Vox Machina on Prime, it's a Dungeons and Dragons cartoon, and there's no way you could translate that to film or show.
And we'll see what happens with that new Dungeons and Dragons movie that's coming out, which honestly I have no interest in, because it just looks like it isn't going to work.
It could be fine, but Vox Machina is perfection in that what it can do with an anime-ish style animation. Like it's great, right? So,
well, I think one of the issues with the Dungeons and Dragons movie is that like they're taking Dungeons and Dragons and then making it into a story, but Dungeons and Dragons itself is a story. Like, you're basically taking fantasy stories and making your own story. So like, it's not gonna feel like Dungeons and Dragons. Like, I feel like if I was making a Dungeons and Dragons movie, I would get like the guys who made like Into the Spiders, like what's their name, like Phil Lord or whatever, the guys who made like Lego Movie and who made Into the Spider-Verse, and just make it like super tongue-in-cheek and super self-aware. So like I saw someone who posted, I think on Reddit or something like that, and they're like, have it be that like one of the characters dies and a new character comes back with the exact same actor and stuff, but totally different, and no one ever talks about it. Or like all the NPCs are made by are played by the same character, just wearing like a different hat or a mustache or something. Like, just make it super self-aware.
And like the kobolds all have the same like the accent. It's like, hey, what are you doing here? And it's just, but it's the same voice actor for like 50 characters.
Exactly. Like at one point, one of the characters is just not around because he couldn't make it tonight. Like, just do that kind of like. I think the problem is that they made it too serious, and it's like it's Dungeons and Dragons. Like, no offense, it's like you're not going to replicate how good a story or campaign is, right? So I don't know. I'm excited to watch it, but it's just one of those like you've missed the point.
Yeah, that's why I like the Vox Machina approach. It's like serious but not as well. And it's Critical Role. I mean, they're perfect. Which
and
also
again,
ties
also
in
like
to
when
Last
games
of
have
Us.
so much more personality because they are a little bit more over the top. Live action has a really hard time of doing that. You know, not everybody can be Deadpool or like most like Marvel characters where they are very over the top. They also have a much larger budget, so they do kind of have that advantage. Whereas with animated, you can make things so much more lively. Like anime has so much personality to it. Even the shitty animes have a lot of personality to them. They tend to be shitty personalities, but they're still really over the top personalities nonetheless. So I think it really just is a matter of if you're going to do, especially a live action series or even a movie for that matter, you got to make sure that you have the ability to make it work. Because if you're just doing it for the sake of generating money, it's going to fail. Because that's literally what like 95% of all things between 1995 and 2020 were.
Yeah.
I now just am thinking of like how to make a D&D movie, and like halfway through, one of the main characters like just changes, and everyone's like, "I thought you were a bard." It's like, "No, I want to be a paladin now. I'm a paladin." And then like everyone's like, "Fine, whatever."
Or the guy like takes a swipe at something, and the attack just doesn't do as much damage. He's like, "No, wait, no, I didn't roll that right. Sorry, I dropped the dice on on the floor. That's not fair. That wasn't an actual roll," and they re-roll it.
Yeah. Like that's now I'm just writing that movie in my head.
I'm still writing.
I'm still super glad that like the series did really, really well. So at least it shows like there's proof of like, okay, this is where it should be if you're going to do it right. Like this is the standard now. Start making it like this. Now there's going to be a couple that are underneath the bar, but as long as they're like close enough, I think people will be okay with it. As long as it's not like in the egregious category, which is, you know, anything that was really done between, especially in the 2000s. Oh boy,
we have a blueprint now, and I think that's what's important.
Yeah.
So
I was just happy at the end. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was happy at the end when all 9 episodes were over. I looked at my fiance and I said, "So, you know, you basically just watched a Twitch stream for 9 hours, right?" She wasn't happy.
Like, see, you can do it.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I think that's about does it for this week's episode. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking around with us. If you like that and you want to hear more, don't worry. We've got you covered. There's lots more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Look for PixelPlay Podcast or on YouTube, PixelPlay Podcast there as well. If you want to be part of the show, email us with questions, comments, concerns. Join us on Discord, talk with fans. We have all that. It can be found on our link tree, linktr.ee/PixelPlay Podcast. I've been one of your hosts, Kaylan, aka Catastrophe, joined as always by Adam, CS Radical, and Chris at Gin and Chris. With that, thank you so much, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye for now.